All right, class. Today in our naturalism materialism piece of the pie, I wanted to talk about dating techniques because, especially in this origins debate, the age of the Earth becomes quite significant. And part of why it's significant, let me give you two aspects. One is if in a natural reading of Genesis, it appears to be a literal 24-hour day creation where God rested on the seventh 20-hour day. If you're taking that literally, then it's very problematic if the universe is 14 billion years old, more or less, and the Earth or our own sun is, coming in at over 4 billion, 4.5 billion years old. And so, and with evolution, without these long periods of time, it's already mathematically improbable to the point of impossible. But I mean, I wouldn't go that far, but you need large amounts of time if you're going to have mutations going from a single celled organism to the complexity of a mammal or a human being, right, in particular. And so 6,000 years obviously wouldn't be near enough. And you'll notice as Darwinian theory came more and more into the mainstream, we also see ages of the Earth exponentially get longer from the 19th century to our present time. And so I have a video for your viewing pleasure, and I'm going to do it like the Eugenie Scott video. This is from a old Earth evolutionary perspective, and I like it because he covers a lot of different dating techniques, and then I'm going to do some critiques as we go through. And at least a couple of them I know more about, especially dendrochronology, because I'm a lover of trees. I've spent a lot of time with the trees that are talked about in this video, and I'm going to share a little more insight on that. So I hope you enjoy this, and here we go.
In the 17th century, a theologian called James Ussher worked out the age of the universe based on the chronology of the Bible. It was created, he concluded, in October 4,000. Today, millions of people this calculation is about right, and that the overwhelming evidence of geology, cosmology, paleontology, chemistry, astrophysics, geophysics, stratigraphy, and biology is wrong. So let's take a look at what that evidence is, starting with a principle.
Okay, real quickly, someone can Google this if you want, but I think the last time I checked, in the Orthodox Jewish calendar, this is the year 5780, and they are counting from the day of creation. And these are Jews that are doing a literal historical hermeneutic as well. And so 5780, even under 6,000 years old, I think that's super fascinating. Basically, what Bishop Ussher did was he simply looked through the chronologies of the Bible, but since it's not always exact ages of how old people were when they had children, etc., he does kind of like a mean to get the around 6,000 years age. But that's how that number came about.
That even creationists don't dispute. The golden rule is that newer sedimentary deposits are always laid on top of older ones. So except where rocks have been folded, this orange bed would be older than the green one, and the green one is older than the blue one. Geologists can then follow a single bed to make similar deductions in a different locality. The dark grey bed may be at the surface or even at a higher point than the others, but it's older than all of them, and the light grey bed is older still. What we end up is what's called the geological column. To get the absolute dates of these rocks, scientists use a variety of different methods. I'll start with one of the easiest and most recent. We all know trees have rings because in summer they grow faster than in winter. But seasonal growing conditions vary according to the weather, so the bands will vary in size. Each time period in each geographical location has its own distinctive pattern of tree rings, like a fingerprint. So if we take wood of a known age, we can match the oldest part of it with the youngest part of another piece of wood, and so on back through time. Back 10,000 years, in fact. and already way beyond the biblical chronology. Okay, I'll spend a bit of time on this one because creationist preachers seem to be obsessed with it. Our upper atmosphere is constantly being bombarded by radiation from the sun. When a stray neutron hits a nitrogen atom, it changes it into carbon. But this is a heavy and unstable form of carbon called carbon-14, or C14. The normal form of carbon is C12. In the atmosphere, C14 combines with oxygen to make carbon dioxide, which is then absorbed by plants and into the bodies of animals that eat the plants. The ratio of these two isotopes in animals and plants is roughly the same as the ratio in the atmosphere around them. But when the animal or plant dies, C14 decays over time and reverts back to nitrogen. So compared to C12, which doesn't change, the amount of C14 falls at a constant measurable rate. By measuring this ratio inside the dead animal or plant, scientists can find out when it died. Before I look at other dating techniques, I'll bat a few hoary old myths about carbon-14 out of the ballpark. No, it's not. But sometimes, rarely, a sample is wrongly dated because it's contaminated. Bacteria, dead skin, fungus. If care isn't taken, it's the carbon in these contaminants that gets dated rather than the sample itself. That's why samples from different parts of the same plant or animal have been known to give different results. But a similar thing can happen with any kind of sampling. Contaminated samples don't invalidate the principle of DNA analysis or chromatography or spectroscopy. We know they work, and we know carbon dating works. Firstly, carbon dating can be checked against artifacts of known age. Secondly, it can be checked by sending the same artifact to different labs for analysis. Thirdly, let's take a sample of organic material from each of these layers. If carbon dating was random nonsense, you'd expect the chronological order of these samples to be all over the place, but that doesn't happen. The results show each of these samples in its correct chronological order. The ones from the upper beds are younger, and the ones from the lower beds are older. Is it magic, or is it because carbon dating works, and that's why it's used? To quote Kent Hovind, samples don't come with labels attached, telling the lab their age. Testing is always blind. If it's not blind, it's not science. And if creationists don't trust the carbon dating method, they're perfectly welcome to conduct their own blind tests to prove it wrong. But carbon dating isn't used on diamonds and coal, and for very good reasons. As I explained, C14 is formed when neutrons collide with nitrogen atoms. The C14 used in carbon dating originated in the atmosphere. But you can also get it deep underground, in places where decaying uranium is giving off neutrons. Coal and diamonds are made of carbon, so you'd expect to find higher levels of C14 in coal and diamonds close to rocks that contain uranium, and much lower levels away from those rocks. That's exactly what we do find. Carbon dating is only used and only useful for dating organic material in the topmost sedimentary layers. Now that we've got carbon dating out of the way, let's quickly run through a few more absolute dating methods.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about that before we go on, and if there's any questions, feel free to raise them. And the first thing I want to bring up is this principle or presupposition developed by Lyell and others, and it's called uniformitarianism. And uniformitarianism is this belief that things are happening today more or less like they happened yesterday, more or less like they happened 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, 1,000,000,000 years ago. And if you accept that presupposition, you can apply uniformitarianism to look at the rate of decay in carbon-14 molecules. You can look for it in potassium-argon dating techniques where you have a measurable rate of decay. You can apply it to things like trying to determine how long would it have taken the Colorado River to have carved out the Grand Canyon. And basically, how this works, you simply would need to measure how much sediment the Colorado River is removing in an hour, right, from the region of the Grand Canyon. Then you simply times that by 24, times that number by 365, and then that will give you the yearly amount of sediment that's being removed from the canyon area. Now, if you were able to calculate how much sediment had been removed from a mile wide or a mile deep canyon, and then divide that, the amount of sediment removed divided by the amount being removed per year by the Colorado River, that's where we get our estimates for the age of the Grand Canyon. And so they didn't just pull them out of their hat or make the number up. It's based on this presupposition of uniformitarianism. Now, I'm not opposed to this presupposition, but I want it to be acknowledged as a presupposition. You can use it for other things like the magnetic field around the Earth, the decay of the magnetic field. You can look at sedimentary deposits in the Gulf of Mexico, and how long would it have taken the Mississippi River to deposit so many feet of sediment in the Gulf. And so it's an interesting technique, but many creationists are more into what's called catastrophism. And catastrophism, instead of uniformitarianism, where you have a steady uniform rate going on, catastrophism looks more like a heart monitor, where you have extreme floods, earthquakes, cyclones, asteroids, and these are going to mess up not only the amount of carbon in the air, but rates of decay, rates of deposition, and these sorts of things. So be aware of uniformitarianism, and that is a presupposition because, once again, we're doing this off of inference, not off of testable sorts of things. Now, we can test how much carbon is in an object, or carbon-14 is in the object. The problem is, do we know how much it had at the beginning? So what are we measuring? And I believe the half-life of carbon-14 is right around 5,900 years. So you already see the problems if we're talking about the difference between a young Earth creationist who believes the whole Earth is younger than that, just barely, and other people who believe it's in the billions of years old. Any questions or comments before I go on? I see your question, Vanessa, but I'm not quite sure what this has to do with the dating technique. All right. Any other questions before I let him continue? He's going to move into some other techniques. Also important, if you noticed, carbon-14 dating can only be used on organic material, and it has to be 50,000 years old or younger, because after that point, it's not going to be able to, it should have been decayed to the point where you're not getting any readings at all. Now, what's curious is there have been a few recent finds where soft tissue has actually been discovered in dinosaurs. But these dinosaurs, according to current models, lived up to 60 million years ago, if you can imagine. And so here we have these. One was a T-Rex, I believe, thigh bone, and when they found it, they had put it in like a plaster cast, but it had broken open, and there was like this stench, and the people were like, "What the heck?" There's a smell to this, what they believe was a completely mineralized thigh bone, but inside there was mineral encasing, but there was still actual bone and soft tissue inside. And when they were challenged to 14 dating it, they said, well, that would be pointless because we know this fossil, this has to be in the 60 million year range, and carbon-14 dating is only good for, say, 50,000. I would say, just for giggles, it would be interesting to try. Another recent find was a Triceratops. They found a horn that had not been mineralized. There was still keratin in it. And someone did carbon-14 date this one, and it came out to 40,000 years. Once again, this is supposed to be like a 60 million year old dinosaur, and here we have a carbon-14 dating of its horn or parts of its horn at 40,000 years. Now, that's not great for young Earth creationists either, I'll grant you that, but 40,000 is a lot closer to 6,000 than to 60 million. And I just think that's curious. So let's go back. Let them talk about some dendrochronology.
Biologists know that human DNA mutates at a fairly regular rate, and they can trace these mutations back, like following the branches of a tree back to the trunk. It's not a greatly accurate method, but it does give a rough idea of when humans migrated, and a very definite idea of where. It doesn't lead about Ararat 4,000 years ago, but to Africa around 50,000 years ago, just as other dating methods suggested it should. Every 250,000 years or so, the Earth's magnetic fields flip over, and the South Pole becomes the North Pole. Magnetized minerals within rocks show the polarity of the Earth when the rocks were laid down, so throughout the geological column, rocks show a regular magnetic banding depending on the polarity of the Earth, and that can be dated. Potassium-argon dating works on the same principle as carbon dating, but instead of carbon decaying to nitrogen, we have potassium decaying to argon. And instead of a half-life of 5,500 years, we have a half-life of 1.3 billion years. That means the method can be used for dating rocks and fossils hundreds of millions of years old. The technique has largely been replaced with the far more accurate argon-argon method, and there are other decay processes that can be measured in different half-lives, such as uranium-thorium and rubidium-strontium. Radiometric dating takes us back to the oldest rocks we found on Earth, 3.8 billion years old. If you want to go back even further, you have to look into space. My video, The History of the...
Okay, when we talk about the radiometric dating, this is often used, obviously, for rocks, for non-organic sort of material. And much older dates, much longer rate of decay that they're looking for. The problem is, once again, scientists have measured ancient lava flows, but they've also measured lava that they knew, observable lava coming out of the ground, and yet it's being dated in the millions of years. Now, part of what I would think would be an explanation for this is perhaps the rock that's being molten and being poured out of the earth, but it has to do with this radiometric dating technique and looking at the rate of decay of these molecules in the rock. And there's just so much discrepancy between dating rock ages that we know, at least when they're created from magma, and rocks that we know were expelled hundreds, if not thousands of years earlier through observable human records. All right, let him continue.
The Universe Made Easy explains how we can calculate the age of stars and galaxies, so I won't repeat that here. Just take a look at the video. What's important is that the results fit perfectly with the chronology we find on Earth. The Sun, for example, doesn't turn out to be younger than the Earth or older than the universe. Its age, based on the amount of hydrogen fused into helium, is exactly what you'd expect. And as with dating methods devised for rocks on Earth, the method for measuring the age of stars and galaxies is devised first and tested afterwards. There's no way of knowing in advance what age these tests will show, but every time the age confirms the known chronology of our world. As technology expands, new dating techniques are constantly being developed. If the world really was around 6,000 years old, you'd expect them to show it, or at least disprove the established chronology. But they don't. Every new technique confirms what we know. There's thermoluminescence that can measure the number of trapped electrons on the surface of volcanic rock. The speed that continents are drifting can be measured today, so their position millions of years ago can be calculated. It matches perfectly with the geological chronology we've already worked out. Climatic banding in sedimentary rock.
just a minute to talk about his continental drift. This is kind of interesting because when it's a relatively new theory. I mean, when I was in school, it was just kind of coming from the fringe into the frontier. And I believe now continental drift is basically taught at, if not a core scientific principle, it's certainly very, very strong theory. And at least and we can actually observe this taking place right now, especially in like Iceland, because the Atlantic, there's two plates in the Atlantic and they go right through Iceland. And that's part of why there's so much thermal activity there. It's literally the crusts are splitting apart. And so you have all this magma and stuff coming up there as the plates spread and drift. But that spread, it's like at the rate of growth of a human thumbnail or fingernail. So it's very small, and that's what we can measure. If uniformitarianism is true, that's a really great way to measure if we did have a supercontinent of Pangaea, and then you look at how many thousands of miles, say South America is from Africa right now, you can use that to predict at that rate of spread, the growth of a human fingernail, how long would it take for Africa and South America to be over 3,000 miles apart. And so I think that's a reasonable way. It's just relying on this idea of uniformitarianism. Is it possible the continents spread apart quicker at some point and then slow down at later points? And is there a point where they may actually, the plates, bring them back together again? And so those are all, once again, I don't think it's a foolish theory. It's just based on this uniform idea of things basically acting the same today as they did in the past.
Rocks can be measured, caused by a wobble in the Earth's motion every 12,000 years. I could go on, but there's no time here to list every dating method, let alone spell out the details of how they work. But if creationist preachers are so convinced that every single dating method is wrong, and that the single story they tell is the result of either a huge coincidence or a giant conspiracy.
You can see a few strata there. That looks mostly like sandstone. They showed an example of the Grand Canyon and talking about the different geological columns going in there. What is so interesting, though, and if you ever get the opportunity, please take a trip down the Grand Canyon. I know it's expensive, but there's rafting companies and stuff, and they'll take care of you. Answers in Genesis does a trip every year if you want a young Earth creationist perspective. But what's nice is a lot of the people in that program came out of, they have their science degrees at state and secular universities. And so they understand the old Earth geological timeline. And so it was really helpful to be able to ask these geologists, paleontologists, biologists, different questions. Like I could ask them any rock, any fossil, and they could tell me what it was. And not only that, they could give me the evolutionary or old Earth timeline theories or hypotheses, but they could also give a young Earth interpretation. So I found that a really valuable insight. What was so fascinating to me is when we had been traveling down the Grand Canyon for almost a week, and we finally got down past the sedimentary layers. If you can imagine, a mile deep of sedimentary rock laid down, layer after layer after layer. But when you get down to the bedrock, it's metamorphic rock. It's no longer sandstone or shales, but it's this rock that through heat and pressure has been metamorphosed. And I think they were called Vishnu and Zoroaster, that had metamorphosed almost into like this polished marble. But there's a place there at the bottom of the canyon where this bedrock is laid down, and then you have a mile high of sedimentary rock in layers above it, and it's called the Great Nonconformity, because at least according to the evolutionary or geological models, there is I believe, 1 billion years worth of sediment supposedly missing within the space. You could put your hand there between the Vishnu schist and then the sedimentary rock, and supposedly there's 1 billion years missing of what geologists would have expected to find there. And even though we have these really nice geological columns in our textbooks and stuff, we don't have a place in the world where we can see them all. Now, we can see certain bands or deposits that actually go around the world, but we don't have this nice clear-cut thing. And once again, yes, if it took millions of years for each of those layers to be laid down, you could see how you could get into the millions, if not billions of years. But in a young earth creationist model, the people, at least at Answers in Genesis, believe all of this could have been laid down by the flood and actually carved out by the flood while it was still in a pliable state. And so once again, we're not talking about two different artifacts or two different sets of data or two different Grand Canyons. That's the empirical objective piece. Where the interpretation piece comes in is how long did that take to form, what formed it, and that is where inference comes in, whether you're old earth or young earth proponent. Almost done with this.
It's very easy for them to prove it. Hey guys, do your own tests. After all, a few creationists have university degrees in biology and geology. Okay then, devise a dating technique of your own choosing. Explain publicly how it works. Have it tested against samples whose age we all agree on so we know it works. Then go out and take samples of sedimentary rocks throughout the geological column and have them tested by the method you've devised. Not surprisingly, not one of the so-called creation science organizations has bothered to do this. Why not? If the Bible is right, then all the samples would date to around 1,000 years ago and provide strong evidence that the biblical flood was real. But if the Bible is wrong, then the dates will be much older, and more importantly, the chronological order of the samples will be in perfect accord with their comparative ages in the geological column. For some reason, so-called creation scientists, despite their professed faith that the Bible is right, don't think that's a risk worth taking.
Okay. Any comments, questions about that? I agree with him. That's been one of my biggest critiques of creation science. Was I always saw it as more of a anti-evolution stance rather than providing their own positive hypothesis, test, theories. And I think that's changing. I think a lot more of these young earth creationists are actually doing science now and trying to do modeling, looking at water dynamics and currents and depositions. And I think that's really positive. It's easy to bash someone else's research or theory. It's a whole other thing to come up with your own test and then have to defend it. And so I think that's a good challenge. And those of you that are science majors or into these things, if you really believe what the Bible says, I don't think you have any need to fear science. And are you able to look at the data and to see where it takes you? Are you able to be aware of your own presuppositions, your own biases? You know, this is part of the scientific method we talked about, having this at least mentality of detachment and aloofness so you don't bring your bias in to skew the testing or the experiment. And I value science. And remember, for theists who believe in both a supernatural and a natural world, science is very appropriate for studying the natural world. It's simply they also have the supernatural element in their worldview. For the naturalist materialist, they only believe in the physical material world, and so that is what it is limited to. And I'm okay with that as well, as long as you don't overstate and say, because of this, the spiritual can't exist. And and we'll go on from there. Okay. Next, any questions on any of that before I want to highlight a little bit more about dendrochronology, since I actually know a little bit about this one, much more than the radiometric or the carbon-14 dating. Right. Well, in dendrochronology, let me share my screen with you again. Dendrochronology is the study of tree ring dating techniques. And here's an image. This isn't one of mine, but these are bristlecone pine trees growing in the White Mountains of California. And please do yourself a favor and make a point to visit this place sometime in your life. These mountains are on the east side of the Sierra Nevadas, and on the other side of them is Death Valley. So it's this high mountain range. White Mountain Peak is 14,000 feet. And the reason they're called the White Mountains is because there's a white stone and soil at the top of this mountain, and it's made from dolomite. And dolomite is metamorphosed sea creatures, calcium carbonate, and other minerals that have been turned into stone through heat and pressure. So we have what was once at the bottom of the seas, now at the peak, some of the highest peaks in the contiguous United States in California. Then on top of that, the tree line actually stops about 9,000 feet in the White Mountains. And then where the pinyon pines and junipers stop, and then there's like 1,000-foot elevation where there's almost no trees growing. And then at 10, 11,000 feet, you get the bristlecone pines growing above the tree line, basically. And these trees are absolutely stunning. And they are the oldest single organism living thing we know of on the planet. And some of these, and their ages have been determined not necessarily by carbon-14 dating, but by tree ring dating. And as you know, as a tree grows, each season it gets another ring. And so they developed, it's kind of like a giant corkscrew. Thank God, right? They're not just cutting down the trees and counting the rings, but it's like a giant corkscrew that they screw into the tree, and they extract like a pencil lead width of core sample. They cut that in half or sand it down, and the rings are so tight on these trees because often the growth season is only 6 weeks long. So you get these really tight, fine rings. And I don't know if you can see this, but this is a cross section of bristlecone, and you can see how dense those rings are. But you just count up the rings, and that tells you how old this branch or whatever happened to be. They have tree ring counts going back almost to 5,000 years. And in fact, the oldest bristlecone pine that we're aware of, they actually named it Methuselah in honor of the biblical character of the oldest man living. So if you can imagine approximately 5,000-year-old tree. Now, the oldest bristlecone pine we know of, its name is Prometheus, and it was cut down because the scientist doing the core sample, his auger broke, and he really wanted to get his data before the snows came, and he was able to talk to the rangers. This happened, I believe, in the 70s, might have even been earlier. The rangers actually allowed this tree to be cut down, and to his horror, as he counted the rings, he realized he was counting the rings of the oldest living thing we knew of on the planet. Some of the benefits that came out of that tragedy was some of the protections we have for these ancient ones today, because they certainly didn't want this happening again. Now, interestingly enough, here's a branch of bristlecone. As you can see how these grow, it's not like you can just go in and do a core sample necessarily. And you can see the example down below in this image of how this tree just keeps radiating out. And so let me bring up another slide for you. All right, it's not my right slide. Trying to find my preloaded slide, sorry. Ah. There's no thumbnail, so I'm just guessing which one I'm picking. There we go. There we go, finally. Okay, so here you can see the tree, and they have it then tilted so you can see the cross section and the way the rings grow. And they've actually used bristlecone pines to recalibrate carbon-14 dating techniques to make it better. Because now what they can do is they can take one of these core samples, and then you can see it turned on its side. It looks almost like a barcode. And the reason the rings are different widths is because in drought years, the rings are going to be closer together, and in wet or high growth seasons, the rings are going to be further apart. And so not only can you count all these rings to get a much more accurate date of how many years this tree has lived or how many growing seasons it's had, and yes, there is potential for multiple growing seasons in a year, but usually that can be indicated, and you can see signs of that in the barcode. But generally speaking, one ring per year. Now, they've used this to then count the rings and then do carbon-14 testing on that wood, and you can see how that would help them calibrate. And looking at these patterns, you can also see where the drought years were, where the rainy years were, and we can use this also historically to look back at migration patterns, when some of the pueblos were abandoned in the American Southwest. Not only that, but you can do core samples of the wood, like say in the Anasazi cave dwellings, where they may have used beams, wooden beams to support the roof. You can do core samples of those beams, and you can look at the barcode pattern it presents, and then you can match that up with similar patterns. Now, obviously, more regional is going to give you more accurate, but if you move away into different regions, you have to take that into account. They also believe they've been able to take the chronology of trees, not just from living trees, which go back, like I said, 5,000 years, but then if you take the wood of a dead tree, but still standing, and then line up the barcode, and then you find dead wood. If you find dead wood and then take a core sample and line that up, they believe they've been able to take the tree ring dating back 8,000 to 10,000 years. Now, That I'm a little more suspect of, because it's not like you're just counting the rings of an individual tree. And even for the bristlecone pines, they're not growing like a nice straight ponderosa pine or something like that. The way the rings are radiating and growing out in different ways, they have to take core samples coming in from different directions and then line them up the barcode on the same tree to get the date of that tree. Supposedly, I saw in the Ken Ham Bill Nye debate, Bill Nye talked about a 10,000-year-old, I think, spruce tree in Norway. I looked it up. It's a clone of a clone of a clone of a clone. It's that actual living tree is nowhere near the age of the bristlecones, but using carbon-14 dating of dead wood around it that they believe was from the original tree that this clone of a clone of a clone came from, they believe back 10,000 years. But once again, that's not as clear cut for me as actually looking at tree rings. The bristlecones fall very nicely into a biblical flood model. These would have been like seedlings at the time of the receding of the floodwaters. And I don't know. I think it's interesting. Any questions, comments on the dendrochronology? I'll bring up one more image for you so you can see what I was talking about. This is a picture of what I was telling you about, like the Pueblo, and then taking the tree rings in that Pueblo to match them up to the chronology they'd been building off of living trees and dead trees. Okay, any comments, questions? I mentioned this when we were talking about the study of man. Even though I personally believe the Genesis account gives us a literal 24-hour day, and part of that is because the qualifiers of the evening and the morning were the first day, and that's still how we measure days today. One rotation of the earth is a day. And when we talked about different interpretations of Genesis, I gave you some of the pros and cons of that. My bigger concern than even the age of the earth or universe, though, has to do with the age of man, and it has to do with made in God's image, having a eternal soul or immortal soul, and talking about the fall and the need for redemption. And so without a historical Adam, you can see how anemic, if not downright false, the teachings of Paul become in the New Testament. And this whole talk about Christ being the second Adam becomes problematic if the first Adam was just a myth. We're told in Hebrews, by faith, we believe the worlds were framed by him, not by evidence, not by science, not by logic, not by reason, but by faith. And so in the end, even though this is a philosophy class and we're talking about origins, and in this piece in particular science, it still comes down to a faith issue for me. Now, I would say the same for a scientist, although any good scientist is going to, of course, say they're not operating on faith, but on reason and knowledge. And fair enough. But to me, that's the difference between doing science and practicing scientism. And scientism is where you've turned science into like an ideology or almost like a religion in its own right. And I believe a good scientist is much less dogmatic. They're not treating science as a dogma, but more as a method of investigation. And as long as that's the case, I embrace it. I love it. I think there's a lot we can learn from it. It's very valuable, especially this idea of testing, double testing, blind testing. It becomes really helpful. And any good scientist, whether you're a creationist or evolutionist, hopefully you're going to be aware of your presuppositions and worldviews and how that's going to affect your process. Comments, questions? I don't want to beat this horse to death, but I just wanted to give you some samplers of dating techniques. If you want to go to my playlist, I have some from creationist debunking evolutionist, and then I have evolutionist debunking the creationist, and there's a lot of nice point counterpoint videos if you want to explore the dating techniques more. Come on, my quiet class, talk to me. I still got about 15 minutes, and so I'm going to pivot and just give you, we'll move into intelligent design or irreducible complexity. This should be a video on its own, but I don't want to reboot and start over. So I'm just going to tack it on here. This idea of irreducible complexity states that if there is something in nature that is so complex that all the interdependent parts have to work together to make it functional, and there's no way to get to that in a gradual, incremental way, that would be a deal breaker for a gradual evolutionary theory, where through mutation, genetic material and functionality is actually being added to an organism. And of course, one of the key creationist examples of this would be the human eye, that the human eye is so complex and so interdependent on different parts that you need all those parts working simultaneously in order for vision to take place. That you can't just have the lens without the rods and the cones. Or anyways, those videos are on my site, and I'm not going to get into it right now. The other is intelligent design. Its idea, and once again, it's an inference. When we see complexity, when we
Did the sound go out for everyone else? And is he still there?
Yeah, he crashed for me also.
was it?
Oh, yeah. I don't see anything and couldn't hear you for like the last minute.
Okay, thank you, Colleen.
I don't know if that was just me.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm not sure what the glitch is. So I think that will be good. If you want to see the intelligent design and irreducible complexity videos, they are on my playlist. And I don't know, I think they're worth seeing. And I put some up from both sides so you can get both a creationist and an evolutionist perspective on them. So I hope you guys will join me on Thursday as I wrap it up. And we're going to do social Darwinism and then a final critique. All right, I'm going to stop the recording and